Hello, my name is Lorin Makowitz. I'm here in Graz, in Austria. I'm working here as a university assistant for teaching and research at the Department of Philosophy at the Working Unit for Political Philosophy. I'm developing a habilitation project about membership metaphors in discourses about migration and refuge. The work I'm presenting today is related to that project. The title of the paper I'm presenting now is Uninhabitability of Heimat, Metaphorical Fallacies Caused by Linking Dwelling with Territory. Heimat, or homeland, understood as a metaphorical link of belonging and territory, is not only uninhabitable, but in fact produces uninhabitability. The imaginary linkage of geographic, political, social, and existential categories in the emotionally charged concept of homeland intertwines belonging and territory and reduces membership to the identification with a geographic space defined and delimited by nation states. One result of this reductionist link is the exclusion of people who cannot demonstrate a naturalized or authenticated relationship to that geographic territory. The denial of residency in that territory makes that space uninhabitable for them. However, the uninhabitability of homeland does not only apply to the displaced, the refugees, and the stateless, but also to the imagined own. The evocation of homeland as imagined belonging to a national territory is uninhabitable. It is the cause for enmity, war, colonization, and the abandonment of peace and freedom. For both insiders and outsiders, homeland remains a fictional place and ultimately an illusionary void. Here, an entanglement of dwelling, territory, and belonging is evoked that in reality leads to the relentless sacrifice of peace, freedom, and self-realization. Arguing for the thesis that the metaphor of the homeland produces uninhabitability, I will examine two conceptual fields which connote the meaning of homeland. First, words related to the concept of dwelling, and second, words grouped around the concept of territory. I will then show to what extent the link of these two conceptual fields in the metaphor of homeland leads to erroneous conclusions that in turn lead to flaws in our theoretical understanding of dwellings, territories, and belonging, as well as fatal consequences for practices of inclusion and engagement. The metaphor of homeland gains its evocative power from its connotation with the conceptual field of dwelling. But can one really live in a homeland? And does the connotation of dwelling and homeland contain a fatal categorical error? To answer this question, I am referring to two phenomenological descriptions of dwelling. Wilhelm Flusser argues dwellings are the primary thing, without which no human being in the world would be possible. One must always, no matter where dwell, as horrible as it may sound. One dwelt in Auschwitz, as Flusser writes. Roofs and walls separate the familiar from the unfamiliar, the recognized from the strange. They thereby create a space that allows one to distance oneself from the world, a distance that enables oneself to become outraged by the world and engaged in it. Martin Heidegger argues in his essay Building, Dwelling, Thinking that every human being is conditioned by their dwelling on the earth, under the sky, before the divine, and in communion with other human beings. Heidegger argues the essence and the basic trait of dwelling is the salvation of peace and freedom. Even more, dwelling is not only a rescue from a danger, it enables the realization of one's proper being. Can the metaphorical link of dwelling and territory in the metaphor of homeland fulfill these primary functions described by Flusser and Heidegger? Or does this link endanger the very freedoms provided by dwelling, the freedom to engage in the world, and the freedom to realize one's proper being. The second conceptual field evoked by the metaphor of homeland that I want to explore is grouped around the concepts of language, landscape, and the notion of national territory constructed through them. Since the 19th century, imaginaries of national territories have been constructed in poetry, music, and painting. For example, the Japanese Kokugaku school was an ethnocentric intellectual current that aimed to counteract the modernization of Japanese society by referring to an idealized nativist Japan. The construction of golden age of Japanese antiquity by so-called national scholars served to ward off foreign influence, and especially Chinese influence, to consolidate a national unity led by the Tang dynasty. Philological reconstruction went so far as to reconstruct ancient Japanese writings from the 8th century, such as the Man-yoshu songs, as the archaic origin of modern Japanese culture. A comparable example is the Hebrew language, which existed only as a written language from the 2nd century and was revived starting with the efforts of Elisha ben Yehuda in the 1880s. As a result of this revival of spoken Hebrew, the importance of religion for Jewish identity was replaced by an Israeli national identity defined by territory and language. By cultivating the use of biblical Hebrew, the Jews too could feel they were participating in the nationalistic trends of post-Renaissance Europe. In Europe, the political reorganization after the Napoleonic Wars was ideologically underpinned by nationalist linguistics and other national cultural currents. Worth mentioning are the musical national schools of the 19th century, which not only took up folk songs, but also sanctified the landscapes of the respective national territories. Bedřich Smetana's De Moldau, Johann Strauss' Daniel Waltz, or Modest Petrovich Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition are some of the best-known examples of attempts to take possession of landscapes lyrically and musically as the peculiar property of a nation. Natural landscapes were colonized by the homeland. These linguistic, literary, and musical movements are linked to a series of processes of consolidating power through territorialization. Bernd Bellina describes these as techniques for controlling objects, persons, and relations, arguing that not only spaces are delimited by territorialization, what matters even more are the social practices produced by it, the classification of people, things, and activities through their arrangement in a territorialized space. Nonetheless, it would be wrong to conclude that territories condition culture or that a homogeneous culture can be found within a territory. On the contrary, the fixation of cultures on territories abstracts from all economic, political, and other social relations, whereby this is a false abstraction, since in reality there is no necessary relationship between territory and culture. In the light of these two descriptions of the conceptual fields of housing and territory, it becomes apparent that the metaphor of homeland suggests false conclusions. First, the link between belonging and territory. Second, the link between home and territory. And third, the ontological error of inferring a thou from an it. First, although the link between belonging and territory appears to be intuitively meaningful, homeland contains a metaphorical fallacy that confuses the idea of a scenic idyll with a political and social categories of citizenship. The culturalist and territorial strategies to mark belonging as being part of the homeland deny all people excluded from this territory their recognition as equals and exempts them from civil rights, human rights, or even of what Hannah Arendt describes as the right to have rights and the right to belong to some kind of organized community. Second, The link between housing and territory in the homeland metaphor suggests that a geographical area defined by national borders could allow the same freedoms as houses or dwellings do. However, the opposite is the case. The freedoms to be indignant about the world and to engage in it are reduced to the election of political representatives in national parliaments. The freedom to realize one's actual being changes to become an adaptation to the norms cultivated by nationalist ideologies. Third, another fallacy involves the fundamental confusion of categories, which Flusser called the ontological error of taking an id for a thou. You start to believe in the magical power of things and ideas and even start to love them. The sense of homeland sacralizes an abstract concept and confuses the love for people with the love for a nation. Patriotism does not sacralize an idea or thing. It sanctifies the banal, while it banalizes the sacred, the dignity of the individual. These fallacies not only lead to our thinking about home on the wrong track, they have serious consequences for the discourses and practices of dwelling, belonging, and territory. The national appropriation of languages and landscapes subordinates their independent meanings to tools within the strategic construction of national territories. Both languages and landscapes are reduced to their relation to nationality. Dealing with languages or landscapes without naming their respective nationality seems almost impossible today. In addition to this limitation of theoretical observations, the fourth conclusions also have fatal practical consequences. The metaphorical link of dwelling, territory, and belonging in the term homeland defines and produces an uninhabitable zone. This zone can only create exclusion and discrimination. It also remains an imaginary place for those whose affiliation and identity is to be produced by this metaphor. In contradiction to the feelings of security and belonging suggested by the homeland metaphor, the homeland appears to be an uncanny illusion that does not get its power from something unknown, but from the horrors of a hidden familia, the secretly homely, and is therefore actually the uncanny, as Sigmund Freud argues. In this light, homeland no longer appears as a refuge or dwelling. It becomes visible as a place of trauma and danger. Thus, another consequence of the evocation of homeland is the concealment of actual uninhabitability. In contrast to the inflationary use of the metaphor in discourses about pluralism, multiculturalism, immigration, or social security, places of residence are destroyed by war, environmental disaster, or gentrification. Not the possession, but the loss of homeland. But the loss of home is therefore a virulent phenomena of our time. For many dispossessed, uprooted, and displaced persons, home remains a fiction and a dream. These theoretical fallacies and practical consequences support the initially formulated hypothesis that the construction of homeland produces uninhabitable spaces through the metaphorical link of dwelling and territory. The uninhabitable spaces. In uninhabitable spaces, people forfeit their rights and freedoms, such as the freedom of expression, the right to political participation, or the right to education, work, and social security. Homeland, therefore, subverts the freedoms enabled by dwelling, the freedom to revolt, to get involved, and to realize one's actual being.